Heat 2 is a novel written by Michael Mann and Meg Gardiner, released in 2022 and which is also a sequel to Mann's classic cops and robbers film Heat. Mann is of course a famous crime film director and Gardiner is an American author who specializes in thrillers. Heat is one of my favorite crime films, and as such I was following the release of the book quite closely. A sequel to a film in the format of a book is weird, because the fact that there is no Heat 1 book means we are forced to visualize Al Pacino and Robert De Niro when we see the characters of Heat 2 in our mind's eye. Usually it's the other way around, you'll have a book written and then movies based off the original novel. A bit unorthodox, but in any case, if there has to be a sequel to Heat, I'm fine with it being a book. It's the perfect medium to further explore characters and worlds if, as a creator, you feel you're not done with them. I don't want to see a Heat 2 movie, even if made by Mann himself, for a variety of reasons, not least because, well, how many more times do we need to be let down by sequels, reboots and remakes? So I sat down and watched Heat again to prepare myself for the sequel. There's a retro review of the film on the channel if you want to check it out. If you want a summary of what happens in the sequel, with spoilers, stick around till the end of the video where I'll go into details. I also do have plans to make further videos on Heat with the events of this book in mind, to go into character backstories and document their trajectories. A lot of the characters like Hannah and Neil are given backstories, so subscribe to the channel for more videos. So we begin with a prologue which is set directly after the events of the first film. Neil McCauley is dead, shot by Vincent Hanna, but there is still work to be done. Chris Shiherles is still on the loose. In the movie, the last we see of Chris is him driving away from Charlene, presumably away forever and scot-free. But in the prologue, Hannah knows there are precious hours he has before he has to write off Chris as having escaped. It's quite interesting seeing the fallout of the events of the film. Hannah interrogates Edie, Neil's girlfriend. Mann and Gardiner clearly remember the film quite well, unlike presumably the likes of David Chase and The Sopranos, given his prequel film, The Many Saints of Newark, contained some confusing continuity errors. Because if you remember, there is a scene where Neil and Nate, played by Jon Voight, are talking after the LA shootout, when Nate tells Neil that Chris has gone on his own. If you remember, Edie was in the car, so she saw Nate, she remembers the place, and this information leads Vincent to Nate's doorstep where he questions him about Chris's whereabouts. So it's cool that little details like this are remembered by the writers. Anyway, Chris manages to get away, evaporating into the distance, and we essentially have three main timelines in the book, with 3 or 4 plot threads running concurrently. The first is a prequel set in 1988. It follows Vincent Hanna as a razor-sharp, unhinged cop, tough as nails and chipping cocaine on the side, as he looks to take down a group of home invaders led by a sick psychopath named Otis Wardell. Wardell is a freak who makes sure that the family is home when his crew barge in, as he likes to humiliate the man of the house in front of his family, and more often than not rape the women, even teenagers, and often leaves having killed several of the household members. Wardell kinda reminds me of Wangro from the film, needlessly depraved and sadistic, going further than necessary and with severe insecurity issues upstairs. He is not a cool villain like many in the Heat universe. This is a guy you very much want to see Vincent take out, with extreme prejudice. Meanwhile, Neil McCauley, Chris Shiherles and Michael Cherito, a trio of professional thieves, plan their next heist, planning on robbing the Mexican cartel given they've spotted a building where money is being stored and is ripe for the taking. The 3 different storylines, the cops, the home invaders and the robbers, somewhat intertwine when Wardell gets a whiff of Neil's robbery plan and wants a piece of it. This is one element of the novel I am a little miffed with. I don't like the idea of Hannah and Neil having come so close to each other in the past. Yes, they don't meet and have no knowledge of each other in the prequel timeline, but still, prequels have a habit of making universes feel too small, and it's a bit eye-rolling that for all the robbers who Wardell becomes entangled with, it's Neil McCauley, the same man who will meet Hannah in a diner years later and develop an understanding with. Anyway, we also follow Chris just after the events of the film, where Nate has him fly out to Latin America where he rebuilds his life and image. His wife and kid in the back of his mind notwithstanding, he finds a woman and he finds work. The world he finds himself in is dramatically different from what he's used to. In Heat, the criminals operate in an underworld, invisible among the average folk in hidden networks. The criminals who Chris works with in Heat 2 are on multiple levels beyond what he is initially used to. International level people who work beyond nation-state laws and borders, companies and corporations who sell defense software to terrorists, missile programs to governments, people who operate levels above and beyond, who make Neil's heists look like a drop in the ocean. This free trade zone of communication system exchange, covert military operations, security systems and surveillance software is something Mann was clearly interested in, as much is dedicated to it. This storyline is probably the least appealing, especially in the beginning as it takes a while to get going. I mean, I'm seeing Hannah throw bad guys off buildings and jumping on top of moving cars. Do I really need to intercut this with Chris's morning jogging routines? It also feels like it's a completely different world to what we're used to in Heat, which is good in some ways, but does come off as Michael Mann thought he may have been writing a sequel to his Black Hat film. There's a lot of instances of encryptions and encodings and whatnot. And the thing about a free trade zone was, if I remember correctly, part of the original ending to his Miami Vice movie. We then jump to the year 2000, and it's a little difficult to talk about this timeline without going into spoilers. It is a little obvious that Heat 2 is written around the first film, if that makes sense. For example, there's characters who are in the prequel timeline, the sequel timeline, but are not in Heat, which is of course set slap bang in the middle in 1995. Neil and Hannah also dance around each other's respective storylines without ever actually getting too close. I wonder if that factored into my feeling that the novel lacked a particular central theme. The movie was about cops and robbers, yeah, but there was also the element of De Niro and Pacino having an understanding of each other, needing each other, being flip sides of the same coin, the chasing of perfection, the loneliness, I am what I'm chasing, all of that kind of stuff. Maybe it would be easier for me to visualize in a film, but I was struggling to work out what Heat 2 was about, if that makes sense. A pulpy crime novel is fine, but to follow up Heat, surely there must be some deeper subtext. Maybe something about men having to keep their women at a distance in order to both protect them and focus on the task at hand, but the film has kind of covered this ground already. Hannah as a tough, dirty Chicago cop who does what needs to be done was fun to read. You read his dialogue and you can see Pacino's gravelly voice barking out the lines. Some might find the prequel stuff a bit corny. I mentioned the stuff about literally throwing someone off a building and holding onto a moving car's hood, but in many ways it's as if the prequel side of the book embraces an 80s gritty cop movie vibe. That's definitely the vibe I was getting. There's even a police department head or something who sits behind a desk and chastises the insubordinate Hannah repeatedly. I was half expecting a leave your gun and badge on the desk type of scene. The stuff with Neil and the crew was interesting as well, but a little dry. The thing is, Mann is very detailed in following the build-up to heists, the planning, the watching, the waiting. There's a lot of descriptions in the book, a lot of rich technical jargon, immaculate attention to detail. And even aside from all of that, there's a lot of descriptions of the LA landscape, scenery and stuff like that. And really, even as an avid book reader, I'd rather see this than read all these descriptions. So I'd be lying if I didn't say I was a little bit bored at times, rereading paragraphs in my head because the words weren't sinking in. But when the book gets going and hits those highs, it can be quite captivating. Is Heat 2 a must-read? I don't necessarily think so. It's a good read. I enjoyed it as a crime novel fan, and as a Heat fan it provided further insight into the characters we know and love. It's action-packed and engrossing, but honestly isn't treading new ground. It's fun, but it lacks the elegance of the film. It suffers from a lack of Mann's visual storytelling, which is superior to his written prose. In my retro review of the film, I mentioned there are also coincidences that the film's plot hinges on, but they're better hidden than they are here in the book. Like the climax of the book, explosive and cathartic as it was a bit eye-raising how somehow magically almost all the principal characters drew together at the same place over a few days in the year 2000. Like Neil, Hannah and Wardell all operated in Chicago in the 80s, and they all relocated to LA in the 90s? Really? Would I like to have seen a film version of this? Not now, definitely not. But I wouldn't have minded a more tighter version of the story made into a film if Mann had made it shortly after Heat. So in terms of a quick spoiler summary, Hannah is on the hunt for Wardell and Neil is setting up his heist. Neil has a Mexican woman he's romantically involved with, and she also has a daughter. Neil and Otis Wardell use the same garage to get new vehicles for their crimes, and it's through this that Wardell gets a whiff that this guy Macaulay is planning something big. Hannah misses his chance to nab Wardell during a home invasion and subsequent police chase. Neil's heist in Mexico is full of bullets and gunfire, but ultimately successful. But during the crew's return to the US, it turns out Wardell has captured and is torturing Neil's woman. Wardell tortures her for information. She leads him into a trap when Neil is stationed and he takes out Wardell's crew, but he's unable to stop him killing his woman, and Wardell escapes with the millions Neil made in the heist. This plot ends with Chris and Michael arriving onto the scene with Neil holding his dead woman in his arms, and it's from here he starts to become detached to people and has the philosophy of not making attachments. I suppose it's more realistic for Neil to have experienced hurt and pain to become the way he is in Heat, and it was an emotional highlight of the book, but the cold anti-hero who's been burned with previous heartache is a generic done-to-death trope. I think I prefer Neil as a stoic, consistently disciplined professional with no close ties, who uncharacteristically fell for Edie and for the first time opened himself up to someone. That, in a way, feels more compelling and ultimately more tragic. I would rather have respect for Macaulay than sympathy. Fast forward to 2000 and the Mexican daughter is working as a hostess, and she comes across Wardell, who has used Neil's money to reinvent himself as an owner of whorehouses where trafficked women are working. He's already being hunted by Hannah again because a woman was recently murdered and Hannah recognizes Wardell's signature. Bit convenient that Wardell was quiet for more than 10 years, and what's more convenient is that Chris is also in town on business, now involved in high-stakes criminality and partnering with a Chinese woman who's battling adversaries from a rival family. Chris wants to also tie up loose ends with Charlene, but also wants to kill Vincent Hanna, who he stalks as Hannah chases Wardell on a highway, who has kidnapped the Mexican girl. We end with a big shootout where Hannah shoots Wardell dead and Chris facilitates the young girl's escape, but he's unable to take out Hannah. Chris continues on his international adventures out somewhere in Asia, and the final scene of the book has Hannah in Nate's bar, his hunt for Chris reignited as he demands information. I imagine this is a segue into Heat 3, which from what I hear Mann has already planned. So it's a book worth reading. It has good parts, it has uninteresting parts. It's not a must-read, it's a little overlong, but I do think a Michael Mann, hot off the success of Heat in 1995, could take this material and conjure something majestic with it. But alas, the time for that is long gone. Would I have read this if it wasn't connected to Heat? Probably not. It doesn't add much to Heat, but thankfully it doesn't take away much either. Unless Mann has a cinematic go, the book will probably fade into obscurity, relegated to trivia games and pop quizzes where you're asked which famous 90s crime novel has a sequel written in 2022. If you have any questions about the book you want answered, feel free to leave them in the comments below and I'll try to answer as much as I can. If you've read the book, let me know what you think of it, and thanks for watching. Before we finish, I'd just like to thank my patrons, Nicholas Curtis, Daniel P and Countess von Zarovich, and also my channel members, Michael Awatwi, Rikers, Damien Irving, the new on Goam24, Lan Deng, Joe Grossberg and Cam Medina.